but the language is already drastically different if you were to go be a senior in high school. How does that happen so fast if we are raising those kids with our language?
Well, it's really language change does happen very fast. It can happen in a couple of decades, but
Mm-hmm.
there are different types of differences, and that's sort of key. So, if you're talking about vocabulary is very superficial. It's an extremely easy thing to pick up because how often do you say hella? Right? I mean, you don't say it all
Right.
that often, or
I don't know if I've ever
BFFR.
said it, to be really honest with you.
Probably not. I live near California, so I'm in the area of Northern California, so I probably heard it a lot more and maybe even used
Oh,
it
I know
myself.
people say it. That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
But
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, so or my daughter is talking about a word now called say she's like, oh, he had maximum riz. And
Riz, I just learned about that like
yes,
a couple months ago.
I love listening. It's very handy having teenagers because I learn a lot of new
Right.
lingo, but I can pick
That's what
those
I'm
up.
saying though, for you, for like you using you as a great example, right? With your teenager. Okay. It's not that long ago that you were the one, your generation, our age, whatever was driving the conversation. So to already have so many words we don't understand, how does that happen?
Well, because as I was saying, vocabulary is very easy. It's so easy to learn new words. I mean, I could set a task for myself to learn a new word every day and I could do it. But I can't
Mm-hmm.
set a task for myself to learn a new vowel every day. So, yeah, there are
Right.
different levels of language that can change and vocabulary is the most accessible one for change and it's also the most visible one. So, if I start producing a vowel slightly differently, so a great example
Ah.
is the a vowel. It's actually very different depending on where you're from in the United States. So, and if I'm
Mhm.
from California or Nevada, I'd say I'll put my groceries in a bag. So I
Oh yeah,
back my
yeah,
ab,
yeah,
but if I'm in New
yeah,
York, I'll
yeah,
bag my groceries. So just
yeah,
that one
yeah.
little change, but that's taken a lot of incremental little changes to get to those, and people don't notice them
Hmm.
until wow, it's 50 years later, and suddenly you're putting your groceries in bags. But
Right.
but vocabulary items though, I could just pick up. So if my daughter is using Riz, I can go, oh, that's kind of a cool word. I mean, she hates it when I do that, but I can.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's pretty easy and it has a lot of power. So if I pick up a word that's young and hip and I use it in school, it gives that quality to me pretty quickly. I mean, as long as it's authentic. So
Ah.
I can't use it very easily. If I walk around saying Riz, I don't get a lot of
Right.
friends that way. But if my daughter
Yeah.
uses it, it makes her fit in really easily. So it's a very accessible way to learn new things to make you fit into a group. But I
Mm.
think the more substantive changes, which people think is just a vocabulary people have stuck in, but it's actually not. And as I have a whole chapter devoted to like because it is fascinating. It's actually a
Mm.
grammatical feature, and it has a really interesting function. Actually, several functions, none of which are just an arbitrary word stuck in. So it's not actually just a vocabulary word. It's a much deeper level of shift, and that actually though has come into our language really fast since about the 1990s. So there were some Canadian researchers that looked at data from the early 1990s and compared that to one decade later in Canadian speech and sort of spontaneous speech that they had a corpora of or a collection of. And they found that the use of like used in this non-traditional way as a discourse marker or a quotative verb had increased about 60% in that one decade. So here
Wow.
is something that shows an example of exactly what you're talking about with, you have in the 1990s, people didn't use it all that much. It was sort of relegated to a specific group,
Mm.
young Californian kind of identity. Then all of
Hmm.
a sudden it took off like wildfire. And now we are 30 years later and like is everywhere. So it did travel very quickly. And that happened because a very influential persona or social identity gets associated with that feature that it becomes recognizable not just to the people that are using it initially, but then whatever quality it represents starts to be considered useful or whatever purpose it serves to more and more groups really rapidly. So it's spreading this way across the social hierarchy. So it starts in one group and then within, a few months, it's, oh my God, that's really cool. I'm going to start doing it. And then it just
Mm.
picks up steam and it happens with young kids first. So if you look at the same research that these researchers in Canada did, they studied very young kids and it's up to, I think, 14 or 15-year-old kids with like use. And they found that the younger kids used like more than the older kids, which means
Mm.
that what happens is the younger kids are looking to the older kids for models, linguistic models. And when something seems like it's an up and coming feature, like new thing that's happening that has a really positive identity or a positive association, or it's useful in some way, they don't just pick it up. They pick it up and go to the extreme with it, which is why when
Hmm.
my daughter was 6 or 7, she used like all the time. She still
Okay.
uses it to some degree, but I remember thinking, holy crap. I actually think it was more of an expletive I said, but
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
you get my drift. I
Yeah.
noticed it. It was so obvious. And we see that. We can listen to our kids say dude or like or something like that a lot at a certain age. That's usually slightly younger kids, like 10 and below, because they're practicing and they're trying it out. And we call that the adolescent peak, which is where their use really skyrockets because they've taken a feature that's used in the next generation, like the next decade up, maybe a 15 or
Hmm.
16-year-old, and they're learning it and they're trying it out and they're playing with it. If it feels successful, then they'll slowly dampen their use, but they use it as still at a higher amount than the people before them. Then the children coming up behind them use them as the model and they go even further in its use. So within decades, you can go from sort of just starting to appear as a feature to once you've worked through, a 5-year difference, all of a sudden the 5-year-olds, when the 15-year-olds were older, get up to be 15 and now they're using it at a rate higher than those original 15-year-olds did. And it has become a new form in their speech. Does that make
So
sense?